All right, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for coming. You've all been carefully chosen to participate in our training and in our exercise. As you know, we're going to have our exercise, our full-scale exercise, on August 22nd and 23rd. What we hope to accomplish in that exercise is to be able to test some of our planning assumptions on how we would respond to a major emergency. So I kind of wanted to give you some background about this. While I was on so-called vacation last week, my husband brought in this USA Today. And you know, you don't really want to read this stuff when you're on vacation. You kind of want to just clear your mind of it. But you know, the article essentially explained that that cities that had been funded, Chicago being one of them, that despite all the funding that the federal government has given us for preparing for a major event, Armageddon, if you will, that cities were really not prepared despite all the funding that we've received. And the project that I'm talking about specifically is called the City Readiness Initiative, or CRI. And it's a project where the federal government, I think at one point, woke up and said, gee, despite our best efforts, and despite the fact that we've really tried to infuse a whole lot of money into the public health system over the, since 9/11, that cities are not prepared. As much as the federal government is prepared, the federal government cannot come in and do the work of a local unit of government. All they can do is prepare at their level and give us funding to hope that we prepare at our level. But there's no real assurances that despite all the funding that the federal government has given cities in particular, that they would be able to do City Readiness Initiative. And in a nutshell, the City Readiness Initiative is the federal government gave 21 cities across the country millions of dollars, in our case $2.1 million, to say, we want you to do a planning effort. And that planning effort says that you need to be able to prophylax, give medications to every resident in your city within 48 hours of us dumping the medications on your tarmac. So the city of Chicago, with their $2.1 million, went and just put our heads together. OEMC, Chicago Department of Public Health, EMS, fire, streets and sanitation, general services, parks, schools. There's been a huge, huge planning effort and a planning initiative that's gone on over the last year on how to, once we get these medications, how do we distribute them to our residents? And a huge piece of that, obviously, there's all sorts of logistics of how you get the medications from the airport to your distribution centers, and who's going to deliver it, and how do you break it down, and how do you prepackage it, and who does security, and how do you do crowd control, and all those sorts of things. But the thing that we really need to worry about is the major piece of it, which is how do you get the medications in every resident of the city of Chicago within 48 hours. And when you sit back and you think about it, that is a huge undertaking. And what we're doing today, and over the past year, all these players, the multi-agencies, have come together and developed our best guess, a plan, a strategic national stockpile, a CRI, City Readiness Plan. Now, the next step of that plan is then to train on that plan. And after you train on that plan, then you need to do an exercise. You need to get out there and see whether or not the plan that you put together is going to work. And if it doesn't work, we need to come back to the drawing board, replan, retrain, and re-exercise. So the point of today is, let's take that plan, let's train on it, here you are, and then let's exercise on it, which is August 22nd and 23rd. My beeper never stops. I love my job. Okay, so that's what the City Readiness Initiative is. It's getting pills or vaccine into every person's arm or mouth within 48 hours of the federal government delivering it here to the city of Chicago. That's our job. That's why we're here. Now the question is the city ready? If you go back to that previous slide, the bottom line of that USA Today article was no, cities weren't ready. Now, I'm not exactly sure how they came to that conclusion, because actually when the federal government came out here and surveyed our plan, or did a evaluation of our plan and walked through it with us, and we had to do this plan in 180 days. Imagine doing a planning effort like this in 180 days, bringing all the people that you needed to the table. Imagine the urgency that the federal government felt about a situation like this if they give you a whole boatload of money and say, do this and do it in 180 days and better be good. And at the end of that 180 days, the federal government did give us one of the highest rankings for preparedness. So then to see the USA article today saying cities are not prepared, I'm not sure exactly where that came from or how they came to that conclusion. I'd be interested in hearing that. But what I would say is that we haven't tested our plan, so there's no real assurances that we are really that ready. So that's what this is about, training on it and exercising on it so that we can prove whether or not our plan is really going to work. And I don't think we'll ever fully know that answer until hopefully we will never have to implement it. But we can get some really good information if we exercise this plan and then go back to the drawing board. And that's all we really need, is to come up with something that we really think is going to work. So is the city ready? And then we'll test that on August 23rd, or test pieces of that on August 22nd and 23rd. And then is the health department ready? And we hope so. I think we have a leg up on so many of these things because, as all of you in this room have known, we've done some major events. We've done our meningitis, we've done flu every year. We've tested it, but under less stressful conditions, under conditions that would not totally stress out our plan. So we know how to set up clinics, we know how to do immunizations, we know how to give out pills, we know how to do it pretty quickly, but would those things that we already know how to do, would it work under a situation where you had to do it in 48 hours? And that's what we really don't know. We knew it worked in meningitis, we know it works in the flu clinics, but the setup that we have and the way that we do the things that we do, will that work if you had to do it in 48 hours? I know we wouldn't be able to do the kind of patient teaching people are used to doing. It's here you go, goodbye. That sort of thing. We're not used to really working that way. That's not really the way we've done things. We would have to sort of switch our mindset to say, what we're going to do is we are going to work for the masses and not necessarily for the individual. So we may have to make choices, and I talked about it the other day. It's sort of kicking back for me into ER mode, all those years in ER, where when things got so crazy busy, you switched your mind and you said, I'm going to work for what's best for most people and not necessarily for this one, because you just didn't have the luxury of that. And we're going to have to change our thinking and think more like that when we're in that sort of situation. And that's what we have to kind of think through today. So is the health department ready? I hope so. I think so, but we'll test it out. Now, the overview of the exercise, what we're going to be doing on the 22nd and 23rd. You'll get an overview of the plan, but essentially the plan is this. If we had to do this in 48 hours, City of Chicago would be divided up into 5 quadrants. Each of those 5 quadrants was selected because of the density. So each of them roughly has about the same population, give or take 100 or 200,000, okay? In each of those regions is 11 clinics, okay? So we have 55 clinics that we would designate across the City of Chicago, okay? And you'll get all this later, but I just want you to sort of know sort of the overall picture so you can kind of picture it. And then within each of those 5 regions, obviously, you're going to have a central command post so that they can staff those regions, make sure that the staffing is appropriate, make sure that if people need forms, if there's, medical questions, that those 11 clinics within that region have someone that they can relate to and talk to and discuss their problems with. So that's going to be called an ATC. What that stands for, I have no idea. We've done so many algorithms, I can't keep up with them. But anyway, there's an ATC in each of the 5 regions, and that's sort of the command post. That's where people will go when they're called in everyone will go to each one of those 5 regions, or one of those 5 regions, and you'll be sent out to a clinic from there. So people aren't going to be going, taking their cars and you're going to be assigned to one of 55 clinics and driving over there. You're going to be assigned to one of those regional places, one of those 5 regional places. That's how we'll know what our staffing is, and you will be bussed out from there, okay? So day 1 on the 22nd is going to be about testing people coming into those regions, okay? And second part of the day 1 is going to be then taking those people, mobilizing them out of there, and having them set up a clinic. We're going to be setting up 2 clinics, okay? So people will go out and they'll either be assigned to this clinic or to that clinic, okay? That's day 1. And then you'll set up those clinics, and we'll test whether or not, given a plan, that people can actually set up that clinic and do it quickly. Because if you've got 48 hours, you're not going to be lollygagging around setting up a clinic. You're going to be setting up a clinic and going and opening the doors, okay? So there'll be tons of pressure on us to get those doors open and get them open quickly, okay? So that's day 1. Coming into the Regional Transportation Center, the ATC, getting staffing, figuring out what the staffing is, getting on the buses, going out to the clinic, setting up the clinic. Done, day 1. How did it go? Was it good, bad, whatever, okay? Day 2, August 23rd. August 23rd is going to be about opening up the doors of those clinics and serving the patients. The thing that we really need to test, sort of the bottom line, is whether or not we can get everyone done within 48 hours. So we've broken out and figured out in 55 clinics, you can do X number of people per hour, per line, okay? And we've done this before in flu, and we did it for top off, but there's been really no urgency or any real need to sort of wonder how many people you can process through a line. In this sort of a situation, it's going to be all about how many people can we process through a line. So what we hope to do on day 2 is to figure out, take our plan, look at it, figure out how many people it says we can process through a line. I think it was 110 or 120. I don't know. Mike Robbins would know that more. And then figure out whether or not, with hordes of people coming through the door, whether or not we really can do that. And if the answer to that is yes, great. If the answer to that is no, then it really means plans have to be reworked, redone, or we have to figure out why it's no. Is it because we weren't trained enough? Is it because the staff's not fast enough? Is it because we're not clicking onto that ER mode and we're still into that patient teaching mode? What happened that made it not go as smoothly or as quickly as it needs to go? And figure out the answers to that. It could be we need more clinics. It could be we need more staff. So those are the sorts of things, when you're working those things, what we really need to get from you guys at the end of the day is good ideas about why you think this works, why it doesn't work. So when I say you were specially selected, you were specially selected because we feel you are the people that can give us good information and give us good feedback and to be honest and critical. Shoot holes in it. Tell us what was good, what wasn't so good, so that we can go back to the drawing board and that we can either redo our plan or tweak our plan to get us to the point where we can process the number of people that we need to put through on each line in order to prophylax the entire city in 48 hours. That's what we need from you.
Before I start in the actual dispensing, I wanted to do a little bit on the City Readiness Initiative. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with what CRI is, and just to give you a little bit of background in why the plan's been developed, how the plan's being developed. As most of you know, public health has always done, prophylaxis. They do flu clinics. They, if there's an outbreak, there's all sorts of different times to go out in the community and hand out drugs, or give drugs to people who've been exposed, give vaccinations. But what we've had to do with the City Readiness Initiative is figure out how to do it on a much larger scale. Last summer, CDC awarded funding directly to 21 major cities, and this was to make a plan to hand out medications to every person in your population within 48 hours. And it wasn't just figuring out the plan, this is the numbers, this is how we do it on paper. It's actually figuring out from an interagency perspective how, like, what is police doing, what is CTA doing, what do we need to support this kind of operation. And I think that's where it's really different than how health has always operated in the past. Health is very good at setting up smaller clinics and manning and staffing them themselves, but if we ever had to do this on a whole large scale, you would definitely, or we would definitely need interagency collaboration to get this done in a timely manner. So as I said, our CRI goal, or the mission that was put before us, was to figure out how we would prophylax or hand out oral antibiotics to our entire population, which is 2.9 million people, and we need to do that within 48 hours. The 48-hour timeline is always a little debated as to what constitutes the 48 hours, but I can tell you our plan here in Chicago, 48 hours is from the time we are ready to open the doors to hand out the first pills until we would be able to hand out the pills to the last person. It doesn't count that time in between of us deciding that we need to prophylax the population to the time that we're ramping up, getting everything in place, and getting ready to open the doors. So one of the challenges in putting this whole plan together has been figuring out how do we compress that time frame. If we're saying it takes 48 hours to just hand out the pills, and we know we need to ramp up, and that's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of different agencies to participate and a lot of individuals, how can we do that, do it well, do it timely, and keep it short so that we shorten the time to handing out the first pills? Most people probably are real familiar, so I'll go through this kind of quickly, with the Strategic National Stockpile. In 1999, Congress charged the Department of Health and Human Services and CDC to establish a national pharmaceutical stockpile, or that's the Strategic National Stockpile, or S&S. And that's the push packages, and I know everybody here has been through S&S training in the health department, so I won't go into the full details of this. All right, with S&S, just a quick recap, the federal government, they have some responsibilities the same as we do on the local end. The federal government will maintain the inventory of medications and supplies. That's on them. They're figuring out what we need. They're keeping it all updated. They'll deliver the medication and supplies to us once we request them, and their mission is to get it to us within 12 hours. That doesn't mean they're sending us everything within 12 hours. It means that they're getting us the initial, here's the push package, here's what you need to get started in 12 hours. But the following supplies will be continuing for a longer duration. And then they're helping to facilitate state and local planning. On the state and local, so this is what we're responsible for, is developing plans and the capacity to receive the S&S assets. And this is really what we've been focusing on. What are we going to do? The feds are going to drop this stuff off at our doorstep, and we have to figure out how we actually get it out to the people. In Chicago, our S&S CRI plan, again, as I had mentioned a little earlier, we started with this really last summer interagency collaboration to get this done. In the past, over the past few years, the health department was taking, the lead on this and, trying to work with all these different agencies, but we didn't have a lot of cooperation, so it was very difficult to try and get some of these things done. We know the health department did not have the right facilities to have open as dispensing sites, tried to go to public schools, and public schools, they were working with us, but they were working with us very slowly. With the CRI process and making it a full interagency collaboration to get this done, we've had great cooperation from the schools, and we've been able to do a lot of the planning and move very quickly through this in a relatively short time frame. We're also using an all-hazards approach. The mission that was put before us with CRI was oral antibiotics, but the same system that we're setting up for oral antibiotics would be used for injectables. If we had to hand something else out, we could hand something else out at these dispensing centers. So we've really been trying to figure out what the foundation is, how we would go about the whole process to get accomplish what we need to accomplish and hand out whatever to the public. And then we've also developed our plan to be scalable, to develop multiple different sizes of events. This would be a great plan to implement during flu season. You might as well go ahead and try it out. Would we need to do it in 55 sites? No, that's probably not feasible or practical, but you could implement this specific plan in 2 locations at the same time. So the pieces are there for whenever it's needed. So with S&S, we've really looked at the city, and we knew one of the most important things in trying to provide services to the whole city was that we provide equal services to equal populations. So sat down and looked to see where the people live in the city and then drew lines. And we divided the city into 5 regions, each within 25,000 of a population of each other. So these are our 5 regions. They really go against the way the city's been drawn for everything else. It does not match the public health regions. It does not match the police department regions. It matches where the population resides. So we have 5 regions, and with each of these regions, we know that we need one ATC, or what we're calling our Assembly Transportation Center. And that Assembly Transportation Center really is going to serve 2 purposes. It's going to serve as where all of the workers for that region report to. They get assigned, they get assembled, they get transported from, so we know where everybody is going and that we're putting adequate staff at each of the sites. But then it's also going to serve as the command and control for that area operation, for that regional operation. The sites that we're selecting for our ATCs, they're large indoor facilities. Again, we are not sure if this would be a summer or winter event, so we had to make sure that we're able to implement this in all different types of weather. We know that we need the large parking areas. When I go through the numbers at the end, you're going to see we need about 1,500 people per region to work per shift. Where are you going to park 1,500 cars for the workers to report to then send them out? So we had to take that into consideration. And then we had to look for easy transportation access. Not everybody drives. What's accessible by public transportation? Then we did the math a little bit further, and we figured out, okay, we need 132 lines running at 100 people per hour in each region to accomplish our mission within 48 hours. So we figured that we need 11 dispensing sites in each one of those regions. In selecting the dispensing sites, we had to pick sites that are well known to the public, that are handicap accessible, and that meet the minimum space requirements. One of the things I learned right away, we thought, well, public schools would be great. They all have large gymnasiums. They serve a lot of kids. A lot of the gyms are on the second floor in the public schools because the swimming pools are on the first floor. So it was really a greater challenge than we anticipated to find enough sites that had adequate floor space to do this type of operation in a timely manner. So we have 4 components really of our dispensing plan. First is the dispensing vaccination centers, and again, that's what I think we're all most familiar with. The second, what do we need to support those dispensing centers? You need an assembly transportation center, that ATC, which is the command and control, the organization assignment of the staffing and transportation. And then on top of that, we need the joint operations center, who's looking at what's going on in all 5 of those regions and putting the big picture together, and that happens at the JOC. And then finally, we need the receipt, staging, and storage, the warehouse. Where's all the drugs coming from, all the material, all those other type of things. That's a piece of the plan that we're definitely going to, starting in September, jump in full force and figure it out down to the detail. What we need to do, it's not part of the exercise, and it's not part of what we're going to be going over today. So just real quick on the flow of operations, just to give you a little picture of how this actually occurs. And there's 2 ways to think about it. I always like to think about it from the end user. What do we need to do to get the medications out to the people? That's what the DVC operation is. What do we need then to get the DVCs up and running? What do we need to make the DVCs work? That's the assembly transportation area. What do the ATCs need in order for them to function efficiently? That's the joint operations center. And who's in charge? What does the Joint Operations Center need? Everybody needs a leader, and that's really what that command staff is. The command staff is looking, overarching what's going on at the city, figuring out our priorities, figuring out what we need to do, and then it's being communicated down that way. Obviously, there's arrows that go both way on this chart, but if you look at, the marching orders come from the top through the JOC to the ACT down to the DVCs, but we're also feeding information back up the other way. An important piece of this whole plan is obviously public information, and as part of this Joint Operations Center, there would be a Joint Information Center, making sure that we're giving out coordinated media messages. This is really what we have to take and figure out how to put into these buildings. What we had done is we sat down and we figured out, okay, to get the medications to the people, doing it timely, and doing it in a manner that is requiring the least amount of staff, but to do it safely, because every time we do it at one center, we have to multiply that times 55 times 3 different shifts. How do we do this and put it into a building? So this is what we decided we actually need to do this safely and maintain some standard of care, a high level of care, but also balance it out because it's an emergency situation. And this looks pretty confusing. It can be pretty confusing. But one of the things we've really done in developing this plan is saying that we know some people are going to be able to be trained, the majority are not. So this is really a big just-in-time logistical operation. How do we make this work? So we've tried to simplify this as much as possible so that we're training people to do one job, you report to one person, you know how to reach out to one person. So there's just very few people that need to have the huge big picture and understand how that whole operation works, and we can really just start plugging people in to a lot of these different roles. All right, so what we did was we had to take that and figure out how to put it into buildings. We knew what we needed to do, but then we had to figure out how and it goes into the buildings. And I think Bill Cards here and Mike Robbins and some other people were very instrumental this past, was it February through May? Had some good geography lessons in the city because we had to figure out at 102 different sites how to put this into that building and to make it work. So we had an interagency team that consisted of Department of Public Health, Emergency Management, the Police Department, the public schools, and the Park District, and I believe City Colleges was part of it a little bit. And then we hired a vendor kind of to be a note takers to say, we wanted to just walk around and say, this is what we want here, this is what we want there, but we didn't want to sit down and type it all up because that takes a long time. So we had a vendor as our project manager for this piece of it, just putting all of our ideas on paper and writing it up for us. But the things that were real important in figuring out how to operate these dispensing centers in one of these locations were all part of the site survey. So obviously we had to figure out where the stations were located. How do we do it so you have enough room in between so that people are, spaced out a little bit and they're not hovering over the staff workers, but also that it's not so spread out that it's impossible to secure the school where we are. How is it all on the first floor? So figured out where the station locations were. Patient flow is a big issue. Obviously, this is all about how fast we can move people through the process. We had to make sure that the flow lines were conducive to moving people, and we call those our queue lines. Setting up the queue in a gym, I think orange cones and barricade tape is probably the easiest way to do it, but we had to really think if you have this large gym and you're having, reviewing forms over here and handing out the medications there, what do you do with the people between reviewing their form and the medication? You've got to get them organized, otherwise they're just going to rush this way. So figuring out where the queue line should be, how far apart they should be, all of those things went into these surveys. Security concerns are huge with this. Where are the officers going to be placed? How many officers do you need? That was truly a learning experience. We took CPD out there with us, and they started looking around, and they staff it for their ideal operation until they get back with 55 sites, and they're looking and saying, we don't have enough manpower to do it at that high level of standard of security. So they had to do the same thing that we had to do from a planning perspective. How do you maintain and provide the services, but you have to balance it out in the emergency situation and make sure you're able to deal with everything going on. Other security concerns were making sure the public in and out lines do not cross, something I had not thought about until Mr. Dave Doherty pointed out, what are you going to do with grandma who gets her pills, goes out the back door, you crossed her over people that are waiting in line, have been waiting there for 3 hours, and somebody knocks her over the head to get her pills from her. So we really had to be careful that we were separating the lines. Those waiting to get the pills were queuing and outside in a very different area from those who had just received the pills. We want to get those with the pills out of there as fast as we can so that we're not having those two different groups mix. Ingress and egress routes for our staff, had to make sure, we don't know what it's going to be like out there. We could have mobs of people out there. How are we going to line them up around the block, around the street? But then how do we do that, but then how do we get the trucks in? How do we get the buses with the people in without having them cross over those people in the line? Because if you ask the people to move, they're going to be fighting to get back in line into their right exact same place. Supply delivery, if we had ill or injured people, how do we get them out of that building very quickly? Streets to block off, obviously this would be not routine daily operations. We know that a perimeter around the building would have to be blocked off. That's not, in the emergency, is not the time to try and call Streets and Sand and say, okay, let's figure out what you should block off. We figured that out ahead of time, so at the time of the emergency, all we have to do is tell Streets and Sanitation, these are the streets we need you to post no parking on. These are the streets that cars need to be towed from. We figured that out in advance. Placement of barricades help us to keep directing the traffic. It seems like that's a pretty simple one, but when you start counting up the number of barricades that we actually need to run this whole operation, we can't just say, okay, we're gonna need 5,000 of them. We have to talk to Streets and Sanitation General Services. Do you actually have those barricades? No, we only have 3,000. Well, let's figure out how we can adjust the plan so that at the time we're ready to go, we're not scrambling, and the people that are in charge actually have the supplies that we said we could get to them. Storage areas, that's pretty simple. Running water for reconstituting medications, that seems like a really simple, you think a lot of times we're in the gym. Well, most times gyms just have those little water fountains. That's not gonna cut it. Some of the places we were in, the schools and park districts, I think you're probably familiar with, some of them aren't optimal facilities for being a school or a park. Some of them didn't have easy access to water, so it had to be a little creative in how you structure everything in that building. And then staff break and training area. We know this is a huge demand on people. 8 hours doesn't seem like a lot until you're actually doing it. You get tired pretty quickly, and we know that you're going to need breaks, and we need to get you away from the confusion, away from the public, so that you can actually take a break, sit down, eat your lunch, something like that. How many people do we need to do this? That was one of the pieces that we have developed in the plan, and we're going to really walk through what each one of these people are doing, but minus security, we need 113 people to run this operation for every single shift. And trying to figure out, well, how do you organize them, how do you structure them, we came up with an organizational chart that really follows along with the incident command system. And looking at the incident command system and the principles of that system, it made a lot of sense to then transfer it over to this type of operation because there was a manageable span of control. You had somebody who was in charge. You had each group focusing on specific responsibilities instead of trying to be that one-stop shopping that we're really typically used to. I think in this organizational chart, the biggest difference from how health has normally run these type of clinics is that usually it's always been a nurse who's in charge and running the whole thing. It's a nurse who's in charge of making sure the clinical stuff is done, who's making sure that the staff is getting their breaks, who's making sure that, okay, well, somebody outside agency showed up on site and they need something, the nurse is dealing with that. Well, knowing that this is such a big operation and that nurse is so critical or the clinical person is so critical to making sure that this standard of care is maintained, we've made some changes with this. We've decided that we have this clinical branch, which is in the red. You have a nurse, you have a clinical coordinator over there who's responsible for maintaining the standard of care, making the clinical decisions in this operation. But that's what they're focusing on. They don't have to focus with the supply issue. They don't have to focus with giving staff breaks. They can focus on the clinical. Why I think this is so important, in a real event, we would never have enough clinicians or clinically trained people to fill all the roles that in the ideal world would be filled by a clinician. I'm talking about form screening. Obviously, you would like somebody who understands the medication, who's able to answer questions just like that, to be, screening people's forms to determine is it safe for them to get the medication or is it not. We don't have that luxury in this type of event. So what we've done is we've put a station captain who is a clinician to supervise a whole bunch of non-clinical people. We'll give them frequently asked questions. We'll give them fact sheets. We'll give them the things that they need to do this safely, but we also know we needed to provide a clinical resource. And if you're that clinical resource supervising non-clinical people, you can't be, dealing with Salvation Army showed up, where do you want them to go sit? Oh, the toilet got plugged, how do we deal with that? So clinical is running the operation. Everything that's being done at the site is to support getting the pills to the people. Clinical coordinator maintains that standard of care. Security, I think, goes without saying what their function is. But then we have two other functions on the side. We have a planning section. Who's reporting? Who's doing the communicating up? Who's making sure that the information that's coming down from the Assembly Transportation Center that's getting out to the right people? We have a planning section to do that. And then the logistics section is key in this. Where are the drugs coming from? How are they getting from the supply room out to all the different stations? Who's keeping track of the inventory? Who's calling to say we need more drugs? The facility, we ran out of toilet paper in the bathroom. Who's refilling that? So that's really this logistics operation. All of the non-personnel, non-clinical things that need to get done on site is handled by that logistics section. And then at the top, we have the command team. And the command team is, again, different than what we've historically done with having a nurse running the whole operation. This on-site coordinator is not making clinical decisions, but they're running the site. They're making sure staff has gotten breaks. They're making sure they have the right number of staff on site. They're communicating, making sure that their dispensing center is running in accordance with what the citywide plan is supposed to be. So really, this is the person that has a lot of the headaches. Whatever the clinical coordinator needs to make happen, they just have to tell this person, and this person is the one to figure out how to make it happen in a timely manner. So in that operations section, and this is really the patient flow, this is, the clinical, this is what we're actually doing. The whole dispensing center is pretty much about this. The stations are triage, the medical evaluation. The difference between the two, triage, everybody's coming through triage. Separate those who are symptomatic from those who are not symptomatic. Most people are going to be asymptomatic. We just send them right on through the dispensing process. But we did have to plan for the possibility that somebody who does have symptoms would be coming to the dispensing center. They need treatment, not prophylaxis. What are we going to do to get them out of there? How are we going to evaluate them to see, are your symptoms related to whatever is going on in the city, or are they symptoms related to something else, and it would be good for you to get prophylaxis. So that's what the medical evaluation is. You come into triage, if you're symptomatic, send you to medical evaluation, everybody else moves onward. Hand out some forms to you. Again, and I think Mike will talk more about the form later today, but the form, you have to keep it simple. We're talking about 2.9 million people. How are we going to have them fill out the form timely and keep the process moving? Forms review, somebody has to check that form to make sure it's safe for the person receiving or that we're dispensing the medication to, make sure it's safe for them to receive that primary medication. Anybody who has a problem with that primary medication or they need a further consultation with a clinical person, send them to the clinical consult table where they can sit down and they can actually have a conversation with a pharmacist, with a doctor, to determine what is safe for them to have. And then adult and family dispensing, and I'm not going to spend time on that because I know that'll be gone over in depth this afternoon. There's some other operations that are needed to support what I just described. A mental health team. We know we need to have some people on site. Staff are going to be anxious. They're going to be worried about their families at home. This may be a stressful time. We need to make sure that we're taking care of them. We don't know what may be going on with the public. We might have some really anxious people, some situations to be de-escalated. So we figured we needed some mental health staff there. We needed some clinical support people. One of the biggest things and most important things is telling people where to go. If you don't provide them good direction, the whole operation could slow down. So this clinical support team are really the fill-in wherever we need them to fill in, providing people with information, providing them with direction. Everybody who's working is going to want to take a break, so we had to factor in some relief personnel so that we could have seamless operation, but you could still, if you had to go to the bathroom, you need to take a lunch break, that we could backfill your position and keep the process moving. And then security internally and externally. So then who really is the management staff at these dispensing centers? We went through and we figured out, okay, who needs to be pre-trained? And that's how we comprise who the management staff will be at these dispensing centers. And they are the on-site coordinator and the operations support coordinator. That's really the one and the two responsible for everything going on at that center, making sure what's supposed to be happening is happening. The clinical coordinator, maintaining that standard of care, calling the shots, everything that we're doing is supporting the clinical operation and what the clinical coordinator needs to get the job done. And so under that clinical coordinator, we gave them a little bit of help. We gave them an operations communication coordinator, and this is basically somebody that's on the radios, okay, the stations, you're calling me, this is what you need. I call somebody else and tell them, okay, logistics, you need to take more pens over to the form station. So it's really, instead of running around, we're trying to figure out how to do this with with devices and radios. Staffing manager, the clinical coordinator shouldn't have to focus on who's gotten a break, who needs a break, okay, you're tired of filling out forms, how do I switch people between positions? We have a whole person assigned to just that. They're looking at 112 other people, making sure that we're providing a work environment, that we're not, making them exhausted, that we're not killing them with the repetitiveness of just one job for 8 hours. And then we have station and team captains, and that's really to make it manageable. That clinical coordinator and the staffing manager can't really focus on 90 people in their section. all the time. So we know that if we put a station captain, each station captain's responsible for running their station, looking at what's going on in their station, and either helping to resolve that problem at the station level, but if they need help, then they kick it up to the communications person, who then either gives it to the logistics person or the other appropriate individual to resolve the problem. And then we have that logistics coordinator, the planning section chief, and the police department. So just real quick to wrap up on this part, how many do we need for one shift? We need 113 per shift. And when we say shifts, we mean 8 hours of providing service to the public. That doesn't count for the time on the front and the back end for getting you trained, getting you assigned, getting you transported to the site and from the site. So really we're looking at 12-hour shifts, but we still have to have 3 of them with a little bit of overlap. So we'll need 339 people per day at each of the dispensing sites. For one region, that means we need 1,243 people for a shift and 3,729 for one region for one day. And that's excluding any security personnel. So if we had to ever do this in 5 regions simultaneously, full scale in the city, in one day we need 18,645 non-security personnel to run this operation. Will the number be bigger? If we had a bigger number, definitely we would use them. It would make it a little bit easier, but this is our bare minimum of what we need to do this effectively. All right, so what do we need to support that? 18,000 people is a whole lot to manage. What do we need? We need staff notification, organization, and deployment procedures. We need coordination between all DVCs within that region. We need a mechanism to resolve problems that can't be resolved on site. Think of like porta potties. What if we didn't have enough, bathroom facilities and we started to have to order porta potties for each of the dispensing centers? Do we want 55 different dispensing centers calling the porta potty company and putting their orders in? It's probably not the best use of anybody's time, but if all of those 11 dispensing centers sent that same request to the region could take care of that and make sure that the resources were being distributed adequately. And then we need a mechanism to obtain additional supplies. In the RSS planning, we're going to figure out how we are getting them the stuff that they need in a timely manner so that they're not always having to call us. But there may be situations where we didn't think of everything, or they are running through the supplies faster than we thought. How do we get that out to them? So I think that really leads into the next piece of this. What do we need to support this whole operation? It's an assembly transportation center for the organization, assignment, deployment of staff, and then the area command, or the regional command and control.
You're here because as an evaluator, you're going to be an evaluator for health. So you need to know some of the various stations, the station setups, as much as the clinicians. And then those people who are going to assist us logistically and with clinical support, they need to know exactly how to help the clinicians. So you're here, it's okay, you're supposed to be here. I've had people ask me, I'm not a nurse, I'm not a doctor, should I be here? So yes, you should be here. Please keep in mind this training is to assist with the drill on the 23rd, but we also need your comment on the evaluation. What do we need to do, to make the training better? How can we roll it out to the various programs? Because we need to start getting into role-specific training. We need to get our staff trained. So please, your comments are welcome. This is a pilot. We want to develop what this is going to look like once we start training everyone in the department. I want to talk a little bit about the purpose and why we're here. A lot of you, this is not new to you. People have participated in MENING and have come to the initial sessions that we had on the bioterrorism program. So basically, this is to refresh CDPH leadership of department plans to conduct large-scale post-exposure prophylaxis campaigns to deter the intentional or natural biological outbreaks and releases. Since Top Off 2, we've introduced some new planning and we've updated the plan. Again, this is to prepare leadership for the drill on August 22nd and 23rd. In your packet, I have put together an array of what I think may be helpful. The other thing that you need to know, especially nurses, and doctors. When you get to the Assembly and Transportation Center, there's going to be 3 lines. You're going to have a line for leadership, there's going to be a line for clinical, and there's going to be a line for other. And nurses and doctors are going to go in there and they're going to see clinical, and they're going to think that's the line they're supposed to be in. But that maybe not. That's going to be for the clinical leadership, like the station captains and things like that. You may have to go to the other line depending on what role you're assigned. Maybe you've been assigned to triage. So in that case, you would go to the other line. So on Monday, you will get the information as to what your assigned role is for the drill that day. So what's the objective of our exercise? Okay, it's going to demonstrate our ability to organize and deploy dispensing and vaccination center staff. That's what DVC stands for, Dispensing and Vaccination Center, within a limited time frame. So we're going to look at how long does it take us to set up these dispensing and vaccination centers. It's going to evaluate our DVC operational procedures. It's going to evaluate the effectiveness of our training tools. That's this training today or our just-in-time training tools that we're going to use at the Assembly and Transportation Center and at the DVC. Then we're going to also reassess our dispensing rate, because if we do put this plan in operation, if we have to, heaven forbid, I mean, we don't want to, we're testing how fast can we get the citizens of Chicago in and out with their prophylaxis. Again, to assess the city's readiness initiative that, you know, we've spent, or the government has spent a massive amount of money making sure cities are prepared to do this, and to exercise our internal DVC communications. If you were at Menenge, you know, it was running to this person to say, I need this. In this operation, we're going to have the radios, and we need to use those to say, I need more clipboards, I need more forms, whatever that is. We will not be running around having to find the supplies that we need. The goal of the PEP campaign is to provide oral antibiotics or vaccines. And it's to provide protection before symptoms begin. Okay, so we're going to identify and rapidly dispense and have a vaccination capability. We need to maintain the medical standards of care. But as nurses and doctors, some of us like to make sure patients understand everything. In an emergency, the standards of care may be reduced. And we have to realize that we may not be able to talk 10 minutes to that person. It's going to be, hello, here's your medication, goodbye. And station captains, if you're at these stations where you find people are chatty, it's going to be up to you to go to that person and say, you need to speak a little faster, you need to move along. And you have to feel comfortable with being able to say that. And that's where strong leadership comes into play. You know, you have to keep your line moving, because the clinical coordinator is the person who has overall responsibility. So we all work together to make sure that that clinical coordinator's job is easy. And that's making sure that the throughput is kept up with, that the medical standards are set, and that we're following those until we reduce the clinical standard. Flexibility, the plan is flexible, so we can, based on scenario, we can make it smaller, we can make it large enough to encompass the whole city. Features, the public will be able to come to that DVC site. They will be able to pick up their medications for themselves and their family and their neighbors. We're going to prioritize dispensing of our first responders. You will get prophylaxed, you know, before we put you on the front lines. We will take care of your family, so at the end of that shift, you'll be able to pick up that medication for your family when you're going home. The plan was updated and is still being updated, so what you have in your packet is confidential. It is a draft. That means it is going to change. There is terminology in there that has changed that we will be updating and changing to match with what we've done. Hopefully, we've developed a more efficient dispensing design. These facilities are parks and schools. There are 55 of them in the city. We can't tell you where the 55 sites at, but for the purposes of the drill, I can say we are assembling at Soldier Field. That's the Assembly Transportation Center where we will be going to, and we will be deployed to a high school and a park. We have put together DVC kits for each site. There are 55 of them. And there are plan books, which I have here on how to set up the site, which once in the afternoon, you'll get to see those. The operations plan. You have a clinical branch and you have a security branch. What we're concerned about today, of course, is the clinical branch. The clinical branch leadership, again, you're going to have a clinical coordinator who is over everything, that whole clinical operation. Then you're going to have station captains. These are the